Although the SQL data source provides a really productive way to get data into and out of your application, it's pretty easy to see early on that there's not a lot of code reuse going on. So I might end up duplicating code across multiple pages. And in larger apps, that may end up being a problem with maintenance and reuse. So another alternative to that, if you don't want to hit the database directly and kind of have a single tiered type of application architecture, is to use the object data source. And the object data source basically allows you to do declarative binding still, but instead of binding directly to the database and having those SQL statements right there in your ASPX, you'll instead rely on more of a better architecture, if you will. So we'll have more of an n-tier, n-layer architecture, where you might have a data access class or classes that you hit, and the object data source can then call those classes to get the data. Now the benefit there is now if something changes, we can go to one place and make that change, versus with the SQL data source, the only downside really is that if a query changes and that query is used across multiple pages, well, now I obviously have to go to all the pages to fix it. So this does support paging, sorting, filtering, insert, update, delete, all that. We can even do caching, so it's very much like the SQL data source, but the difference here is that the object data source, as you can see down here, it ties in to the grid view. In this case, it's going to bind the data to that grid view, but you'll notice it has this select method and type name. So what this is doing is the type name represents the class we want to call. This is our DAL, our data access layer class name. The select method represents the method that we want to call to do select statements. And then of course you can also have delete, insert, and update as well. So you might have a class that's similar to this as far as the kind of stub methods that you see here. So we have a get customers by state, get customer by ID, some select methods. But then you'll also notice we have update customer, delete record, insert record, and those types of things as well. And what we can do then is use the object data source to call those different methods on that data access layer class. So by doing this, we can now modularize or segregate our code into multiple areas. Makes for better reuse, hopefully easier maintenance down the road as well. And we still get the benefits though of declarative binding to grid views, details view, drop-down lists, those types of controls. So let's take a look at how we can use the object data source to make calls into a class that can provide us the data. Using the object data source is much like using the SQL data source, except for we're going to call a custom object instead of calling the database directly. This allows us to break out our architecture into more modular classes so we can reuse those across pages or even across applications potentially. So in this example, you'll see I have what we created in the previous section covering SQL data source, and I have a drop-down, a grid view control, and a details view. And so what I'd like to do ultimately is wire these up to object data source controls, which are going to call into a custom class. Now that custom class is here. It's called BAL. We'll just call that business access layer in this case, and it's going to get countries, get the customers by the country, and then get a specific customer based on a customer ID. So to do that and return those pieces of data, we need some way to query the database. Now we could use ADO.NET, and then we'd have to write connection objects, command, data readers or data sets, and there's a little bit of code involved there. So for this demo, what I'm going to use is link to SQL, which is one of the data access options available in .NET. You really have two main ones, link to SQL and entity framework, and then those are called object relational modeling tools. Now if you don't want to use those, you'd have to go to the ADO.NET I mentioned, and you'll have to write a little bit of code in that scenario. So I'm going to right click on data, we're going to say add new item, and what I'd like to add into here is a link to SQL classes, and I'm going to call this Northwind. Now this is going to give me a designer surface that I can then go to the database explorer, and let me point out that I have a database here, Northwind, in the app data folder. So I can now drag on a table onto here or multiple tables and work with it. So the way you can get to the database explorer is you could just click right here, or if you were trying to get to it another way, if you go up to View, other windows, Database Explorer, you can do that. Now, if you're in a paid version of Visual Studio, then you can actually go view Server Explorer, and you can get to it that way. So what we'll do then is we'll go to the Database Explorer. You'll see I already have it open to our Northwind tables. So I'm just going to drag on this customers. That's what we'd like to query. And there we go. You can see it renamed it to customer because this represents a single entity. And then here's the different fields for that particular customer. So let me go ahead and save that. Now what I'm going to do is come into here and we'll take out the nulls and have some code snippets kind of prepackaged to just add. So we're going to add these and talk a little bit about link queries. So in this example, you'll see I'm using this thing called a Northwind data context, which lives in the data namespace. Now going back to here, the name of this file is Northwind, and therefore the class we'll use to access the database is Northwind data context. So we're going to create a new instance of that. Then we're going to write a link query. And this link query basically says for each customer in the customers, and I'm going to give it an alias of C, select the customer's country, but I only want distinct countries. I don't want to have duplicates, and then return those as a list. So that's kind of our first query. What that'll do is give us back a list of string, and we're going to bind that to our drop-down list. All right, for the next one, we're going to do a very similar thing, except for we're going to query and get customers now based on the country. So you'll notice in this example I do the same thing. I create an instance of my Northwind data context. I say go grab the different customers, but I do a where clause. So I want to say where the customer's country equals whatever's passed into this method as the country, and then we'll return that as a list. And then finally, with this one we'll do a very similar thing, but we'll grab a specific customer, but we're going to do a where clause based on customer ID. And so it provides a very easy way. You'll notice I don't have to open and close connections or commands or data readers and work with data adapters and the standard ADO.NET classes that you'd have to work with. This provides a nice way to work with databases. And later in this module we'll see another alternative, which is Entity Framework as well. Very similar though in how you can do the queries. Okay, so that's going to be the class that actually supplies my data in this particular case, and I might have some business rules once the data gets returned here. I might do some further filters based on security or something, but for our purposes now this will work great. So now I'm going to come back to Customer Viewer, and what I need to do is bind the drop-down list to a data source. So we're going to say new data source, but instead of picking a SQL data source, we're actually going to come in and we're going to pick an object data source. We're going to query into this BAL. Now, we're going to go ahead and name this countries object data source. And now it's going to say what is the object you would like to query. So you'll notice it automatically picked up the different classes that I have available in my project, specifically in this case because it's a website project in my app code folder. So we'll select BAL. Now it's going to say what method would you like to call. Well, we want to return obviously countries, and then we'll hit finish, and it automatically then will come in and it puts length. Well, we don't want length in this case. It's because it's returning a string, we want to go in and just bind to that string. So we'll go ahead and fix that real quick. So if I go in, what happened here is because it detected we're binding to a string, it thought that, well, we must want to bind to a property of the string, so it picked length. Well, in this case, we just want to bind to the actual string. So we're going to take out that code there, and let's go ahead and run it in the browser and see what we have so far. Okay, and there we go. Now we can, as was shown in an earlier demo, I like to come in and usually have the user pick something. So we'll go ahead and say value is empty strings, text is select a country, and then we'll come in to the properties here. It's just a little bit easier to do and say append data bound items true. And that'll put all the data from the database below that particular list item. So a really nice feature. So let's try that one more time. Looks good. And now we're on our way. So the next part's pretty easy. We can do a very similar thing. I'm going to come in. We can choose a data source on our grid now. Again, we'll pick Object Data Source. This will be our customer's Object Data Source. We'll select our business access layer, and then we'll pick Get Customers by Country. Now, we need a country. Well, we of course have a country. So it's going to say, where do you want to get the value of that? Well, we're going to get it from a control. The name of the control is our DD countries in this case, our drop-down. And if there wasn't a value, we'll just apply null for that. And that's automatically going to pass the country in to this method that you saw earlier. Makes it very, very easy to do that with the Object Data Source. So we'll go ahead and refresh these fields here. And I probably don't want to show all those. So we'll click on that. We'll say Edit Columns. And we'll take out from city on down here. Alright, so that will get rid of the columns. I just want to show a few in this example. So we'll hit OK. Now you'll notice that my data grid is automatically set up to show those particular items. Now I'm going to come in and we're going to say Enable Selection, because we do want them to be able to click on a row, because once they do that, we want to load the details. So now we go through the same process. Do a new data source, object. This will be a customer object data source. Pick our business access layer. Get customer, takes a customer ID. Well, we can get that from a control, and the control is going to be our grid view customers. So we'll go ahead and select that. If there isn't a value, for some reason, we'll pass null. And that's automatically going to grab from the selected value of my grid view. So we'll hit finish there. Refresh these fields, and we want to show all of them in this case. So we'll show all these. Okay, and that's it. You'll see that I now have a reusable class. So if I have other pages that maybe need to get countries or customers by country or whatever it may be, I can now come to this object and update it. Now that updates across my whole site, and any object data source that maybe binds to that particular method, it's automatically updated there. So it's very good for maintenance and reuse. Alright, so we need, says data keys must be specified. So right now we need to go in and make sure that a customer ID is specified here. So let's come into the properties, and we'll come to a property called data key names, and I'm going to put customer ID. And I'm going to do the same for the details view. And let's run that. Alright, so real quick before we go any further, what happened there is because I didn't specify what the primary key was, the unique identifier for these rows, I got an error there because it says, hey, I don't know what to select, or if you're doing edits or something here, how would it know what the key is? And we're telling it through the data key names property. Alright, so we'll select a country. There we go. There's Austria. We'll select, and now we have our details. So that's an example now of how we've broken out our code, a little bit different than SQL data source, because I'm now not, you'll notice if I go to the source, I'm not embedding any SQL statements into my page. Now those are secure from the standpoint of nobody can read that page source code unless they have access to the server, but as mentioned earlier, if that query changes and it's used across multiple pages, it's a little bit of a maintenance headache. So this is good. Now, if I wanted to come in and add update, insert, delete, all that is fully supported with the object data source. In fact, if we come on back and I can click on my one for the details view, we'll say configure data source on the smart tag. And you'll notice there's update, insert, and delete. So if I had a method available for that, then I could simply select it, specify where the data is coming from, and all that stuff we've already done, and we'll be off and running. So that's an example of how the object data source can be used to call into a custom class that has the methods that actually return the data from some type of data source.